This is MetroFocus with Rafael P. Roman, Jack Ford, and Jenna Flanagan.
Good evening and welcome to MetroFocus. I'm Jenna Flanagan. This is our look ahead at the major headlines and their impact on the tri-state area. Tonight, New York City is bracing for the delivery of thousands of more doses of the monkeypox vaccine as health officials struggle to keep up with the surging demand, and the city accounts for nearly a third of the nation's cases. New York is also contending with a sixth wave of COVID and the reluctance among many New Yorkers to mask up. This despite the most transmissible Omicron variant yet and its ability to overcome immunity from past infections and vaccines. And we can't forget about the push to pass stand your ground legislation after a Manhattan bodega worker was charged with murder for fatally stabbing a man who confronted him at work, setting off a heated debate about what constitutes self-defense. So for much more on these stories and their take on what else could drive the news this week, let's welcome back tonight's roundtable of experts. Now, up first, we'd like to welcome Dr. Bob Arnott. He is an infectious disease expert and former NBC News chief medical correspondent. Dr. Bob, welcome and thank you for joining us on MetroFocus.
Delighted to be on MetroFocus. It's my favorite show of all.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
We'd also like to welcome back Naila Amaru. Naila is, of course, a Democratic political strategist and former executive director of the New York City Council's Black, Latino, and Asian Caucus. Naila, it's great to have you back.
Thank you for having me.
And to round out our roundtable and some news, we'd like to welcome back JC Polanco. JC, of course, is a public policy commentator and an attorney, and he's also the new CEO for the Council on Legal Education Opportunity. JC, congrats on the new position.
Thank you. I'm so excited to have started last week, and I'm really very excited to be here with you, Jenna.
Oh, well, you know what, JC, with that, we're going to jump right into the big issue, or at least our top issue right now, with you, and that is the way the city has handled the vaccine rollout for monkeypox. Now, all perhaps, jokes and snickering aside from the weird name, et cetera, this is an incredibly transmissible disease, at least from what we've heard when it comes to close proximity. The issue seems to be the way the city is handling the vaccine rollout, which seems like the city should be an expert on, considering we just did this.
Well, I have a JD, not an MD like Dr. Arnott. But I have to tell you that, this is a serious issue. So many of our New Yorkers are depending on this vaccine, and it caught them a lot by surprise. I've been watching social media and hearing a lot of friends that have tried to get appointments, and they're feeling desperate. They're feeling angry because they truly believe the city should have had arsenals of these vaccines available. And unfortunately, that's not the case. And we have to be honest, we have a very large segment of our population here in New York City that is susceptible to this and is very angry currently at both, and quite frankly, at the city, state, and federal administration. So it's very important that at least from a public policy perspective, that these New Yorkers feel that the government has their back because they're an important part of our city.
Of course. Now, Dr. Bob, I want to get into, did I get it right? Is this transmissible by proximity, or is it as transmissible as Omicron, as we've heard? Who is most at risk for monkeypox, and who should be most concerned about making sure they get vaccinated?
So it's a really good question. It's sustained close contact is really the very best way to say it. So if you have someone who has the rash and you have very close contact with them, they call it an interesting thing, not a sexually transmitted disease, but a sexually associated disease. That means during sex, if you have very long, prolonged contact, or outside of sex, you're just very close to somebody's face for prolonged periods of time. Also, like smallpox, if you have sheets that have been infected, the scabs have opened up, you need to be careful there. If you have utensils, so it's quite infectious. Right now, it has been sex between men, multiple different partners in areas where there's monkeypox. But like a lot of these pandemics, we tend to label, a victim, and we tend to be wrong. It tends to spread through a much wider population. So that's where we're seeing it right now. But I think the key watchword is, if anybody has the scabs or has the rash, it is highly infectious. And what's changed is a wonderful New York Times article this morning saying, look, we have positioned this as a very mild disease, hasn't killed anybody yet. Maybe not such a big deal, but it is a big deal. You know, men in New York are finding it extremely painful. And I think we all went through the rigmarole to try to, get vaccines for COVID and whatnot, and, dialing different numbers and websites. Extreme frustration on the part of many men in New York City who have good health insurance, good jobs, they work hard, got private health insurance. They call the health department, they don't get called back, they try a website, it doesn't work, they go somewhere to get the vaccine. So real frustration because it is a very, very painful disease. Now, two key things there are two vaccines. They're not designed for monkeypox, they're designed for smallpox that apparently work. Trouble is, of course, we're way behind the curve in terms of distributing them. And what no one is saying is it's 4 to 6 weeks until you're fully inoculated. So it's a long period of time. And the incubation period for the disease is about 7 to 14 days. So as Tony Fauci said this morning, and as the former FDA chief said this morning, the cat's really out of the bag. I mean, it's not going to be contained. And we do have what looks like an exponential spread now in New York City. So the key thing is streamlining this so we don't have people in a lot of pain and a lot of distress who just aren't getting the help that they need and deserve.
Well, one more question about the monkeypox medical wise. Is there a chance that it could be at all like what we've seen with some of the Omicron variants of COVID, where you could be contagious but not have any symptoms, meaning you could unintentionally be spreading that? Or is that not the case with monkeypox?
It is such a good question. And because of that long incubation period, you may be infectious. They tend to say, if you look at it, you're going to have what looks like a pustule or a little papule, sort of a pus in the center of it. So if you have those scan rashes, that's when you're most infectious. But it's a great point you make because we don't really know what's happening in that 7 to 14 prodromal window before you have symptoms. And so, as you can imagine, people are relying on vaccines that aren't going to fully work for 6 weeks, 7 to 14 day incubation period. It really means that this is, spiraling out of control, even with, hundreds of thousands of vaccines that are being promised by the federal government. Big issue.
Okay. So, Naila, I want to go back to you and ask, was this a case perhaps of the city being caught off guard? Or is this something where perhaps somebody maybe dropped the ball and didn't take it as seriously as it needed to be?
So I don't have a JD or an MD, but it doesn't take one to recognize that this is an absolute failure of government for not being prepared with a better rollout and preparation for the monkeypox. As it was pointed out earlier on, we are going into our 3rd year of a pandemic summer. And so you would think that all levels of government would have some type of systems in place when it comes to monitoring, when it comes to vaccination rollouts, when it comes to making sure that the vaccinations are distributed in an equitable way. Because I think it's also important to note, how inequities in the vaccination process have also been showing themselves in terms of New York City cases. And so with that said, I think that it is absolutely a failure of government, regardless of whether or not this is unexpected. It is government's job to be prepared and to plan for these types of situations.
All right, well then, JC, I want to go back to you and fully acknowledging that no one on the panel is a psychologist. However, we are seeing with this 3rd wave of an Omicron variant, a lot of resistance on the part of a lot of New Yorkers to masking up again. People seem to be, for lack of a better description, just over it. So is this something that should be considered to be enforced as we start to get ready to go into another fall, where, of course, people will be indoors, virus is much more likely to become transmissible? Or do we allow people to just make their own decisions and hope for the best?
Well, that's a great question. I really think that if it comes to it, the city will absolutely enforce a mask up mandate again. And I think it would, it'll force it. The problem, as you know, is that would be devastating for businesses across the city who are already suffering. That'll be a lot more shutdowns across our city for people that wanted to open up a business or wanted to keep a business going, or even for their jobs. And that's not, I don't think the appetite is there for another mandate. And I think that's something that our decision makers are going to take into account before leading us into another mandate on masks. The truth of the matter is that a majority of New Yorkers are vaccinated. Those that need to be boosted up are. Some of us are waiting for our second boosters. We have to keep encouraging vaccination because that truly is going to eliminate deaths as much or reduce the number of deaths because of COVID. But I don't think the appetite is there to tell New York City that they have to mask up again or enforce mandates before we go into restaurants and stores. It just isn't. It may sound good on paper and it may make sense to stop the spread, but New Yorkers don't want to hear about this again. And they definitely don't want to hear about their children that are in schools having to deal with masking up or shutting down.
Nyla, I just want to get your take as well on any city policy changes that might come with the fall approaching, of course, and then the subsequent winter.
I think the fact that the city has gotten rid of its high alert system in the midst of a spike with the B5 variant is indicative of the fact that the city is really just trying to move forward and adjusting from what used to be, mask mandates when we were in the first year of the first COVID wave to now going into our sixth wave, that the city is most likely not going to go back to more stringent standards such as mask mandates and really just trying to push past and accommodate, as best as it can with the sixth wave. But I would agree with JC's assessment in the sense of the political will for stricter standards such as a mask mandate. We're not going back to those days because it's just not going to happen.
All right, so Dr. Bob, now I want to bring you in and get your take on the wisdom behind the notion of, at this point, there's just not the appetite. There's the political appetite. The public's over it. We're going to let people make their own decisions while still encouraging, vaccines, et cetera. Dr. Bob, did we lose you?
I just have myself muted. So I just think, from the very beginning of the pandemic, we really had this wrong. Up in Vermont, where I was helping the local schools, we said this is an airborne virus. And what we need to do is to test the air. We use a CO2 meter, very expensive, test it every classroom, hallway, bathroom, open the windows when we needed to. We got very high quality masks with high filtration. With that, we didn't shut down at all. We were open for the last 2 years. Kids had a great time. I think the whole shutdown aspect of this was just wrong because fundamentally those in charge of public policy didn't understand a very kind of obscure area, which is called fluid mechanics. It means how does the virus kind of mix in the air? The bottom line is we need to pay attention to ventilation. That is, if you have great ventilation, the masking is a little bit less important. And when we blew it on masks is, someone had a great name for it, and they called it decorative facial wear because it wasn't masking. These dripping, sopping wet cloth things that are of no benefit at all. Either wear a very high filtration mask or not. But I think the bottom line is that because this is not as lethal and because people aren't getting sick, no one's going to pay attention. Nobody's going to pay attention to this. It's only if you have another variant that comes along that's highly lethal that people get all charged up about this. But, I think just a huge number of political missteps that have really turned a lot of people off. And I don't know anybody that's, masking anymore or paying attention because, fortunately we have this Omicron variant. Just one very interesting thought I wanted to share with you, and that is, as you know, Omicron came from South Africa, 25 million HIV/AIDS patients, 17 million treated properly, the rest of them really not properly treated. And it was incubated there. And interestingly, I think we owe these HIV/AIDS patients a tremendous debt of gratitude because, in other words, they harbored this virus for long periods of time. And if it were lethal, they would have died. But by harboring this, they sort of have incubated a new, far, far less lethal version. When I had COVID a couple of months ago, I didn't even know I had it. So, a debt of gratitude to those poor patients is so poorly served and have, such ineffective treatment for the disease for giving us a variant we can finally live with.
Okay, well, that's a very unique take on it that I don't think I've ever heard before. I do want to leave this subject, though, and turn to something that we've spoken about so many times on this show. And JC, I'm going to start with you. Of course, the story about the bodega worker who was charged with murder for fatally stabbing someone who confronted him at work. We know that crime, we've seen violent crime increase, at least within the city. And a lot of people are already on edge for so many reasons. Given the larger political climate around guns, and particularly in New York City, is a stand your ground law the right direction for New York City to go?
Well, that's an interesting question. This stand your ground stuff that I continue to see in the news as it pertains to New York, I think is overblown, and I think anyone pushing for it has to stop. We already have Penal Code 35.15 for you viewers that want to go read it, that governs self-defense in New York. Self-defense is in the books. Self-defense is an affirmative defense to what we're watching now. And the idea that we're going to push something from Florida that became very popular under then Governor Jeb Bush here in New York, considering all of the things that have happened because of stand your ground laws in Florida. If anybody thinks that New York has the political appetite for that, I have a bridge to sell you for about $25 that connects Brooklyn to Manhattan. There's just no political will. This is not the state that will do it. It'll never pass any house of the legislature and get signed into law. So what we're doing is distracting from the issue. We have an issue of high crimes in parts of our city, and we're lying to New Yorkers because we already have self-defense codified in the books.
I just wanted to, can I just jump in for a second here? So what's interesting is, see, I think stand your ground is a terrible, terrible phrase. And here's why. I spent a couple of years with the Marines and Special Forces in Africa and Afghanistan as an embedded correspondent. And they had a slogan which was never stay and fight. That is, if they were at their base and someone could attack the US Marines, they just left. And so I think the idea that you stand your ground, you have a weapon, you can kill somebody is totally flawed. The state has a very, very interesting take on that. And as they say, you have an obligation to retreat. Now, obviously, if your family needs to protect, it's another thing. But in other words, if you're in an altercation, fundamentally, if you have a weapon, you could kill that person, you have an obligation to walk away from that. And that's the key thing. The idea of being on a front stoop and someone comes on your lawn and killing them, I think is just completely wrong. So, JD, you made some great points there, JC. And I do think that people need to understand that it's not a stand your ground defense. If the Marine Corps can walk away from a fight, I think we can walk away from a fight too, which I think is the key issue.
Well, I do want to, though, take that, just go back to at least this particular case. And this, by all, by every understanding, was someone who was attempting to defend their business and their livelihood, again, in a economic climate where so many people are, again, on edge for a lot of reasons. Naila, I want to bring you into the conversation and just ask you, what perhaps is a direction that the city could take to help small business owners feel like they have some authority over their businesses?
Absolutely. So I think I'm not quite sure that the process, again, I don't have a legal background as to why the bodega owner was charged with second-degree murder from the Manhattan DA when the argument is that it was self-defense. But I think that there's certainly an argument to be made when it comes to there is this need for people who, feel that, crime is up, situation like these happen. What are the protections that the city can provide? What are the things that need to be done in order to make sure that bodega owners can feel safe and can protect their businesses and their lives when in the situations that they are threatened, as was the case with the bodega owner who was, very clearly threatened and feared for his life.
And just Jen, another point. Just last October, a bodeguero was killed. These bodegueros at night, it's a very tough job, very scary job, and unfortunately, because of the spike in crime in many parts of our city, bodegueros have been killed, and a lot of people have been killed at bodegas. So it's not like it's just the botanical gardens that Mr. Abba was working in. That's one. And two, something else I want to say. We debated a great deal about Will Smith and the Oscars. I said in public and social media that there's a danger about having this idea that you're going to have a guy stand up for the woman, and he's going to stand up and he's going to go up there and smack Chris Rock in the face because he's standing up, that's a problem. It sent the wrong message to our communities. What we saw here was a woman say, I'm going to go get my boyfriend. He's going to show you. She went out there and got this man to come and harass Mr. Alba and threaten Mr. Alba. This is a problem in our communities. We have to stop this nonsense and stop applauding nonsense like this, because at the end of the day, it doesn't end right for both parties. And unfortunately, 2 families are suffering, 3 actually, are suffering because of the actions that took place that night.
Of course. And I want to thank everybody for their insights on all of those subjects. We do have a little extra time for something that we rarely don't have time for, and that is, what are these stories and narratives you're going to be following for this upcoming week? So, Naila, I'm going to go back to you and ask, what is going to be something you're going to be watching as it develops, as this week unfolds?
So I am watching the polling for the New York 10, and also keeping an ear to the ground on the New York City Council redistricting lines.
Of course. And remind everybody, when is that election coming up again?
August 23rd, everybody, and voting starts early. And you can also, of course, vote absentee if you're not be in town on election day.
Okay, because we have discussed, as JC has noted, we don't always have the best turnout, so it's important for people to know there is yet another election before we get to November. Dr. Bob, I'm very curious. I mean, from a health-wise or just in general, what are some of the stories that are really grabbing your attention?
So the number one thing I'm focusing on right now is Ukraine. This is the biggest tragedy of our lives when you think about it. I'm a director of Health Tech Without Borders, a wonderful group run by a Russian and Ukrainian woman. And we have provided 70,000 visits so far, telemedicine visits. We have a new thing called HoloVision, which Microsoft is helping with us, so that the doctor in Ukraine can be helped by a doctor, say, at Harvard Medical School, looking through the same kinds of lens. We're looking at portable medical records. So we're really bringing a lot of tech to the fight in Ukraine. And I actually am releasing a CD later this month of my first symphony number 1, which was recorded with Czech Philharmonic. And it's going to be called Heroine. And it is dedicated to the women of Ukraine for the incredibly bold and courageous stand that they have taken, supporting their children and their families. Real heroism in a tough situation.
Well, that sounds like an incredibly moving subject to write about, and our first announcement of an album drop on MetroFocus, so thank you. JC, I'm going to give you the final word. What is it that's you're really going to be watching as it unfolds?
I'm going to watch Governor Hochul name who's going to be Janet DeFiore's successor at the Court of Appeals in New York. There's a big push for a Latina to be named to the position. I know that progressives around New York want to see a public defender or someone from that ilk in the law, but it's going to be a large lobby by the Latino community in New York to push for a Chief Justice that is from our community. So we'll see.
Well, you know, we still have a few moments left. And because Naila did bring up the important special election that we've got happening at the end of August, can you, JC, remind us what are the important races that are at stake?
Well, you know, there's state Senate primary elections and congressional primary elections. These elections are taking place now because of some redistricting issues that took place. The courts ruled against the original maps. And because of that, the assembly primaries happened last month, and the primaries for Congress and Senate happened next month. Now, this is the issue. About 98% of all of the elections in New York City are decided in these closed party primaries. So it's very important that people participate in these elections, because just from a numbers perspective, the November election is really a foregone conclusion in a lot of these parts of our city. So it's important that people vote. And it's also important for one more thing. Us independents don't get to vote in closed primary elections. And because 98% of elections are decided in closed primaries, I think it's time that we really have an honest discussion about opening up primaries for independents across New York.
All right, well, that's the note we're going to leave it on. JC, you're always really good at hitting those points, especially about turnout and vote. I want to thank our roundtable of experts for tonight. Of course, our guest, Dr. Bob Arnott, the infectious disease expert and former NBC News chief medical correspondent. Also, thank you to Naila Amaru, Democratic political strategist and former executive director of the New York City Council's Black, Latino, and Asian Caucus. And a big thank you to JC Polanco, a public policy commentator, attorney, and the new CEO for the Council on Legal Education Opportunity. Thank you all so much for joining us on tonight's roundtable.
Great.
Thank you.